Hello, welcome to the lecture series on Science and Faith, completed for Practical Apologetics 334A. Today we will be discussing the historical perspective of science in regard to faith and the philosophical developments in the same areas. To begin with, we must consider the history between scientific discovery and Christian belief. This will be achieved by considering the development of science, its conflicts with faith, the study of nature, acknowledging some of the great seekers of knowledge, and addressing the Darwinism versus design debate. In late history, the source of science has often been attributed to the Enlightenment period as a rise out of the Dark Ages, but this is a myth that prevents us from correctly understanding the nature of our world. At its core, science is the study of patterns in existence, from DNA chains to atomic numbers and even galaxy formations. But this desire to study the order of the universe originated before the Renaissance in the Hebrew culture. Unlike any other culture of the time, they considered the world to have been created and upheld by God. In fact, one of the greatest driving forces of scientific discovery is the doctrine of creation, because it considers who created everything and how it is sustained. Thus, for a few thousand years, humanity has been striving to discover the rational order of the universe, during which there have been several Christian scientists who cultivated many of the currently accepted laws of nature. Another contributed feature is the development of universities, which were founded by Christians to study philosophy, history, and science with a theological foundation. The Judeo-Christian foundation of science is not enough to overcome several of the popular conflicts that have arisen in the history of the Church, but these are myths as well. For instance, Galileo Galilei, popularized as a martyr for his scientific discoveries, has a more complicated story than believed. Though he did discuss with a cardinal the concept of studying how the heavens go, not just how to get to heaven, as well as where biblical consensus fit in to science, they were working towards educating the church in science. The trepidation was due to the fact that Copernican beliefs were still being questioned from a scientific perspective. His later arrest came from a perceived insult by the Pope, during which he was treated quite respectfully, was housed in the vicarage, and was subsequently placed on house arrest. Each of the others have similar stories. Giordano Bruno was executed on a charge of heresy for his religious beliefs in transmigration of souls after death, and while his belief in Copernicus' theory was briefly mentioned, the trial focused on his false theology. In consideration of Nicholas Copernicus, the geocentric worldview was that of the lowest in creation, and was elevated by the new standing among the stars. Not only that, but he believed his theory held biblical harmony, and the idea of controversy between Copernicus and the Church did not develop till 400 years later. With the debate between Samuel Wilberforce and T.H. Huxley, there is no record of the debate that can be reviewed, but Wilberforce noted that it was kept strictly science versus science. In the end, one of the viewers reported that it affected his conversion from Darwinism. Many of the scientific greats who have been the source of myths that have driven science and faith further apart often had records of their praise of God for their discoveries and admiration at the works of his hands. As Galileo understood that God reveals himself to us no less excellently in the effects of nature than in the sacred words of the Scripture, while Copernicus found that the universe was created by the best and most orderly artist, so that not one of its parts could be removed without throwing the whole universe into confusion. Johannes Kepler was awestruck that God like human architect, approached the founding of the world according to order and rule, and measured everything. In the inspired words of Sir Isaac Newton, this most beautiful system could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And Robert Boyle, who acknowledged man who by his intellect should be capable to understand that matchless wisdom and stupendous power, to relish that admirable goodness, to return thanks and praises for the one who created it all. They are not alone, for many other great and small scientists lived for Christ, sought knowledge from the Lord, and glorified him in their discoveries. Though many worship the God of the Bible in their discoveries, there are still plenty of scientists who worship other gods, and even those who choose Darwin's evolutionary theory over God's design. The first thing to take note of is that until the 1800s, natural theology dominated the history of science. It was virtually all for God's glory, and seeking the truth about the world he created. When Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, his theories were not initially well liked or even accepted among scientific circles. As it grew into acceptance because of its supposed ability to make God unnecessary, and became popular, natural theology saw a decline, and atheistic evolutionists have portrayed it as absent altogether. Though seemingly invisible in current times, especially in the media, belief in the God creator remained strong, while evolutionary theory and natural selection have taken on a more dominant and aggressive display. Neither one has backed down, nor has one defeated the other by their arguments and debates. They have essentially reached a stalemate. But in order to cover why scientific ideas rely on God, we must understand the philosophy of science and faith. Thus, we must consider mainstream ideas of how they work together, the many ways in which Christians see this combination, where the support leads, if God is breaking the laws of nature or upholding them, and then review the teleological argument. The secular perspective of science and faith typically fall under naturalism, scientism, or reductionism. Naturalism asserts that everything has a source or cause in nature and is made up of physical properties. This means that the supernatural is entirely absent and discounts the idea of faith in the supernatural completely. In scientism, only what can be tested by science exists, which means science determines reality, and every other belief or thought is subjective to the individual. Therefore, faith has no practical yield in the scientific world, because theology is a personal opinion. With reductionism, it is a simplification of things to their fundamental makeup, the idea that the parts determine the whole. Thus, faith is unnecessary, and everything can simply be explained by breaking it down. Ironically, the last two of these logical theories are based in the fallacies of non-contradiction and composition. From a Christian perspective, there are several different models by which theology and faith can be seen to line up, and one can even blend them together for a more tailored ideology. In the conflict model, we see that faith and science often say the same things, but when conflict arises, one is right and the other is wrong, typically leaning for a strict scientific or strict biblical literalist. For the independence model, they have no influence on each other and never share information or beliefs. Complete separation is required. The dialogue model finds that science and faith illuminate and illustrate one another, but are not always mutually informed. They are also restricted from influencing or correcting the truth claims put forth. With the integration model, there is a more blended intersection between the two spheres, and this makes room for natural theology. but it also requires that adjustments are made in both to retain harmony. Finally, the convergence model, which is more nuanced than the others, claims that when both are correct, there will be no conflict, and that disagreements denote errors in the understanding about either side. Now that we understand where each person might be coming from, let's consider how the following evidence will eventually help us find God. Initially, it is vital to set aside our opinions because they cloud out judgment on the truth. Bias will remain, but challenging oneself to allow the evidence to speak for itself allows us to best understand reality, and then we may apply our worldviews or alter our perspectives. It is also important to understand the limits of science. It cannot answer every question that we ask. Sometimes the answer is philosophical, or theological, or even emotional. There are some things that are outside the influence of science, and we must realize that science can explain the substance, but not necessarily the purpose of that substance. What we find in searching out the truth is that unaided logic often requires outside revelation to achieve comprehension, and reason, rationality, and evidence support biblical beliefs too. Science has no power to make God obsolete, and greater knowledge of the world does not eliminate the need for a creator who formed it. Rather, it demonstrates the need for one. Although we find that evidence supports the existence of God, many question how his miraculous intervention in nature can avoid breaking the laws of nature. C.S. Lewis presents a fascinating analogy of placing a sixpence in a drawer one day, then another sixpence in the drawer the next day, and considers whether when he opens the drawer, there will be 12 pence within it. The answer, based on the laws of arithmetic, is yes. 6 plus 6 equals 12. But that does not account for a thief stealing them before he opens the drawer. This thief is not breaking the laws of arithmetic, only interfering in the situation, or as Lewis wittily says, just the laws of England. In the same way, God leaves reality unbroken, but interferes in events by performing what we call miracles. Continuing on with the theme of the laws of nature, it is time to review how events could have occurred without God's involvement. The laws of nature are patterns that result in a sequence of events, but they cannot make an event take place. Action only happens when momentum is transferred from one object to another, which deduces that if we trace the transfer of energy back far enough, there must be something that began the movement in the first place. Because everything in existence is dependent on the initial impulse, the source would have to have come from a higher power, such as karma, fate, or providence. But karma, destiny, fate, and any other abstract ideas are not oriented to have ordained the pattern and sourced the result, while the providence of God allows for a creator of the sequence and a fountain of energy that propels life. In reviewing our final argument, we will consider one of the oldest arguments of the watchmaker. The idea is that if one were to find a watch upon the ground, rather than asserting that it naturally had been there always, it would automatically be recognized as the intricate and precise handiwork of a watchmaker that made it to tell time. Similarly, nature, though wild and unique, has delicate and ordered structures that serves any number of amazing purposes. For specific example, leaves on a tree serve to turn sunlight and water and nutrients into sugar that helps the tree to grow strong, which in turn allows the tree to take in carbon and release oxygen for humans to breathe. Not to mention the flowers and fruits that a tree might produce, or the incredible cells that make up each portion of the trees. and have the minutest detail. Reasonably, the magnificent design and purpose of each specific shows that all of creation has a designer. In conclusion, science and faith grew side by side through history as philosophy offered both intelligent ways to contribute an advancement in each field. Thank you for listening to Science and Faith lecture on history and philosophy. Here's my bibliography if you would like to research more for yourselves. Blessings in Christ.